Alice, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent, good stuff. We're going to talk a little bit today about the nature of God, phrased with the question, what is God like? So, are you happy to start with the various omni words and maybe defining them in relation to God and the attributes of God?
Yes, so on the A-level specification, it asks students to consider the nature of God and his attributes and his characteristics. So, for example, it asks students to consider the omnipotency of God, how powerful God is, the omnibenevolence of God in the sense of all-loving, and also the omniscience of God, which is all-knowing.
Perfect.
And yeah.
Cool. Okay, so maybe we should take each one in turn and then perhaps talk about them collectively and see if they actually make sense, because it's quite debatable, isn't it? And maybe we should clarify, we're mostly referring to the Judeo-Christian God. Obviously, there's other conceptions of God that we could refer to, but for today's purposes, we'll talk about the Judeo-Christian God and understandings of God in relation to that. So if we start with omnipotence or omnipotence, depending on how you pronounce it, this idea of God as being all-powerful, it's something that a lot of people can get on board with superficially, I think, because they think like, yeah, God is mighty and, all of that sort of stuff. And can do, especially if you believe in the idea of a creator God, that's the kind of act that would require omnipotence, surely. But there are some problems that come up when we look at God's omnipotence. So perhaps we could talk about it from both points of view, like where there are examples of God's omnipotence and where there might be potentially some issues with that idea.
There are clear examples of God's omnipotency in the Old Testament. So, for example, as you've referenced as being a creator, so creating the world in 7 days illustrates his omnipotency, and also his relationship with people. For example, Moses, the Ten Commandments, appearing in the burning bush. Also reference to Abraham and Sarah and her pregnancy illustrate the idea of his omnipotency. However, there are some questions about his omnipotency and his unpredictability and how he uses his omnipotency. So, for example, he sends the 7 plagues. He also kind of anthropomorphizes God in the sense that if we say he's a creator, how did he create the world? Did he do it with hands, as in the human sense, or I think when we look at God and we describe God as omnipotent, as humans, we automatically, or we presume, omnipotency, powerfulness in human terms. And I think that is another aspect of questioning what we understand of God's omnipotency, and how, as humans, do we comprehend such a powerful being that could create the world in 7 days.
That's a great point. And there's a connection there, I think, with religious language potentially as well, the difficulties of being able to talk about God in a way that actually justifies his attributes, if that makes sense. So if it's okay, I'd like to go back to this point about anthropomorphizing God and why that's a problem. So can you talk a little bit about why not just religious believers, but other people who are talking about God might have an issue with talking about God as if he is a human?
Sorry, what I wanted to question what would you be looking for in that way? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about God being all powerful, and you mentioned this idea of creating the world and the kind of issues with thinking about God in human terms, is what I was hinting at really is that a way of kind of not justifying how powerful he is? Like if we're talking about him as if he's a human, does that kind of deny the fact that he's omnipotent because we're comparing him to a human? Is it better to talk about God in a way that actually illustrates how powerful he is, if that makes sense?
Yes, because I think what has come up with my discussion with students is if we talk about God and God's powerfulness and omnipotency is in human terms, we're kind of bringing God down to human level. Does that limit God's power?
Sure.
And we also question, if God is all powerful, then why doesn't he prevent natural disasters? And I think that also it links to the problem of evil topic that students do within the philosophy aspect. And if God could prevent evil, then why does he choose not to? And does that infringe on free will? So it also links to free will as well and predestination. and whether we genuinely have any free will, or is our free will limited? Because if God is, if so powerful, does he have the ability to know and be able to prevent what is going to happen in the future with his power? And also, yes, there is a clear link to religious language, because as humans, we kind of want to understand God and his nature. So I think also it links to the idea of why on the religious language topic we look at God through the via negativa, because do we truly understand only God's nature and the powerfulness of God's nature via the negativa, what God is not?
Yes.
Also, you can consider the powerfulness of God through symbolism or through analogy, for example.
Sure.
So does that limit, if we look at God through analogy, is that limiting God's omnipotency, or is it actually emphasizing it and understanding it as humans better?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of invites the question that, you know, because one of the things the OCR spec wants students to consider, I'm sure others do as well, is the apparent conflicts between the different divine attributes.
Yes.
Exactly. And part of me wonders, is that even the right question to ask? Because if there is an element where we can't understand God because there's that so-called epistemic distance, God is so much infinitely greater than us, and therefore, again, it's wrong to anthropomorphize him. Is it right to ask questions, for example, like, does God's omnipotence contain a logical contradiction? So the classic example given for that is the paradox of the stone. So the idea, you know, could God create a stone that's so heavy that he himself cannot lift? And different scholars have different opinions on that. But I'd love to get your take on that, about whether that's even the right question to ask, or is that just showing that we're limited in understanding an attribute that can only apply to God and therefore can only be understood with reference to that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there's two levels to that. That on one hand, it's right, because it encourages students, I think, when studying this topic, to think bigger and wider, and beyond what is just in the spec, because I think it makes students really question the true nature of God. And it allows them to make those synoptic links from, for example, what we have said is free will, the problem of evil, even Plato, for example, and questioning through a priori evidence and logically reason this powerfulness of God as humans. And if we can, does that mean we truly understand God? And that means God is not as powerful as we think he is. But then secondly, is it right? Because then I find students are just kind of going around in circles. Do we actually ever truly get anywhere? Or do we actually complicate ourselves even more and just get bogged down in so much detail and so much ethical questions that we actually don't understand God's omnipotency at all, and we just come to an end, and have we actually got any further than we have from the beginning?
Yeah, and I feel like that kind of applies to other areas of philosophy as well, where we can get a little bit bogged down in the language and the meanings of different words. So I agree with you. I think it's really important to question the terms that we use. And that was something, like you say, Plato was a fan of, largely, I think, through his influence from his teacher Socrates, who, you know, for example, would say to people, if they say like God is love, or perhaps in the case of ancient Greece, you know, I love Zeus or something like that. It's like, well, what do you mean by love? And what do you mean by these things? So maybe we can do the same when we talk about God as well. If it's okay, I'd like to come back to this concept of free will, which you brought up a couple of times, because one of the omnis, if you like, that seems to contradict the idea that we have free will is God's omniscience, the idea that God is all-knowing. And I guess the way that people are thinking about this, as far as I can understand, is that if God knows everything that we're going to do, how can we genuinely have free will?
Yes, and the thing with God's the idea that if God knows everything, do we genuinely have free will? And I think that when we consider our free will, we just, as humans, presume that we have genuine free will.
Yeah.
But students start to question if God has full knowledge of every single second of our life.
Yeah.
Is it us that's choosing, or is it God?
Yes, definitely.
So, and I suppose it goes back to the Irenaeus theodicy that if we don't have free will, we'd just be like robots, and we'd automatically love God. And would we genuinely love God and believe in him, or is it something we've actually been forced to do? Because we're scared that he knows everything. And if he knows everything, it has implications for death and the afterlife. And he possibly knows what's going to happen to us on Judgment Day.
Yeah.
So he knows every single detail. Even middle knowledge, for example, is the idea that God even knows the choices that we have.
Yes.
Or we're going to have. So it's difficult. And then I think that the thing that links with God's omniscience is the idea of atemporal and sempiternal. So I think the implications, if God is outside of time or moves along the same timeline as we do.
Yeah.
So if God is outside of time, then he doesn't know the future. No, he does know the future.
Yes.
If he moves along the same timeline, then he genuinely might not know what's going to happen to us.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And either way, there's problems, isn't there? Because if we go by the idea that God is outside of time, transcendent, atemporal, then that seems difficult to reconcile with the idea that God is also immanent, personal, omnibenevolent, because how can someone love you when they are so distant? And then equally, if he's within time, that seems to limit his omniscience as well. So there does seem to be a bit of a, at the very least, contradiction here for sure. I'd like to get your opinion, actually, if it's okay, on this idea that God's omniscience undermines our free will. I think a lot of theists would say that that's not the case, but is there a way to actually justify that argument, this idea that actually God can know everything and yet we can still have free will? Is there any way that we can reconcile the two?
Yeah, I think if we go back to Irenaeus, he talks about this idea of God being an epistemic distance, in the sense that he's a perfect distance away from us, in the sense that we then have free will, but we know that he's there and he's guiding us. But it's not that he's imposing himself on us, that we genuinely don't have free will. And I think that he talks about this idea of with the reason Irenaeus talks about the idea of soul making, that we have evil, in the sense that we can be made into God's likeness. So it's not about that God knows everything. He might know the mistakes or the things that we are going to do wrong, but there is a reason that he lets those things happen.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a way to kind of, again, which is the definition of a theodicy, to defend God's existence whilst acknowledging that evil does in fact take place. I kind of use the analogy when I talk about this with students that if I were to look outside my window right now and see two cars hurtling towards each other, I know they're going to crash, but my knowledge of the crash doesn't mean that I've made the crash take place. So perhaps there's something like that going on with God. You know, his knowledge of it doesn't mean that he's imposing that will on us. And I think that's good, actually, because this is kind of tying into miracles, really, which granted isn't on the OCR spec, but is on other specs. I think there's a bit of a problem with the idea of a fully interventionist God, because if God were to step in and perform miracles or save certain people, the question would probably naturally arise, why doesn't he do that for everybody? So maybe we can tie that in, actually, with God's omnibenevolence, and maybe turn our attention to that and tie it in with the problem of evil, because you're right, there is a lovely synoptic link there. So when we talk about God being omnibenevolent, there's tons of questions that can be raised. Probably the most obvious is that question of, well, if he loves us all, why do bad things happen? There's also the question that you could link to the developments in Christian thought topic, which is, you know, what does that mean in terms of implications for salvation? Is it universal, or is it something that only applies to Christians? But maybe we can address the problem of evil first and why that naturally comes up. So is it possible for God to be all loving and for there to be evil? And what theodicies can we perhaps draw in to look at and unpack in detail that would, you know, defend God and also sort of say that there's evil as well?
Obviously, Augustine's theodicy of soul deciding that we use our free will that he's given us to turn our back on God. And the only way that Christians or theists believe that we can come back into a relationship with God is if we accept that Jesus died for our sins. So I think that as humans, we need to recognize that we do have free will. And if you decide to use that free will in the wrong way, then obviously on Judgment Day, God will judge you on how you have used your free will. And that could possibly be an evaluation point for the idea of judgment, and why an all-loving God created hell, in the sense that he knew or he didn't know. Questioning is omniscience again. Did he know when he created humans that they had the potential, or would turn their back on him and use their free will in the wrong way?
Yeah, exactly. Again, another really, really nice link to topics surrounding death and the afterlife. Would a loving God condemn anybody to hell?
Yeah, for eternity. Yeah.
For eternity,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And there's also a really good link to God's omnibenevolence there with Calvin and the
mhm.
death and the afterlife topic, in the sense of limited and unlimited election, and
Yeah.
why would an all-living God only select a certain few for heaven?
Yes.
Yeah, or predestined.
Predestined, exactly. And
Yeah.
again, you can tie that, everything
Yeah.
links, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
predestination is connected, of course, to this
Yeah.
concept of free will, divine
Yeah.
foreknowledge as well. All of these other concepts are kind of,
So
yeah,
you can
tied
also
together.
link it to omniscience there. So God
Yeah,
knows who he has elected and who he hasn't. And
sure.
does that justify an all-loving God?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's lots of things that could undermine each of the
Yeah.
attributes. And especially, again, when we look at omnibenevolence, it might be the wrong question to ask. That maybe the concept of love that we have is perhaps wrong, in the same way that it kind of reminds me, actually, to go back to religious language for a moment, when
Yeah.
Aquinas, he talks about the analogies, actually, of proportionality. So we do have a concept of power, of wisdom and knowledge, and of love, but it's never going to be on the level of God. So could that maybe perhaps explain why it's possible for God to be all of these omnis, and yet there seems to be all these bad things happening that seem to undermine that?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. So do you think then that if we take that view of religious language, like we just accept that we've got a limited understanding of what these qualities are, is that a way to kind of mitigate the conflicts that seem to appear when we look at the different attributes?
Yes, I think, well, as humans, there's two things: we either accept or we don't accept that we can know God.
Yes.
We can truly know and understand his characteristics, attributes, or we accept as humans that our knowledge is limited.
Yeah.
And when we consider God's love is not in the same sense that we would love our pets.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we as humans perhaps need to acknowledge. And when we study this topic, that we're trying to understand something or a concept that is way beyond our understanding, our experiences. And as humans, will we ever truly understand the concept of love, the love that we have for God, or the love that God has for his human creation?
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So again, like lots of different ways to think about this. Going back to omnipotence, if that's okay, there is this concept of divine self-limitation. So it's the idea, essentially, as far as I understand it, that God could do whatever, like that's, again, it's the definition of omnipotence, but at the same time, he chooses to deliberately limit himself for what could be a variety of different reasons. Do you think that there's any credibility in that idea, that makes sense? And if so, why might some people put stock in that idea that God actually could do lots of things, but is choosing to limit himself in some way?
Oh, I feel, is this Aquinas?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
I think there's a few different scholars, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, because there's Descartes who just says that, according to Descartes, that we just have to accept that God can create a square circle.
Yeah, true.
2 + 2 = 5. That for Descartes, God could be capable of doing evil and incapable at the same time, even though this involves a logical contradiction.
Sure.
For Descartes, we just have to accept it. Whereas for Aquinas, for example, where is Aquinas?
I'll double check as well, because I don't know exactly the scholar associated with it, but yeah, I think it might be Aquinas. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, take your time, no worries.
I wanted to get it right.
No, fair.
And it's definitely Aquinas, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think Alvin Plantinga's come up here as well, but in any case,
yes. I've got Aquinas here.
Sure.
So Thomas Aquinas argued that God is completely omnipotent in the sense of a being in charge of the whole world, creating it and keeping it in existence. Aquinas said that he can do everything that is absolutely possible, qualified by saying that everything that does not imply a contradiction is among those possibilities, in respect of which God is called omnipotent.
Right. So different to Descartes' view then.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. And again, it kind of reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, the problems with an interventionist God, because if God were to intervene every time, that would presumably undermine our free will and take away from it,
Well, we
especially if
just
we,
become really reliant on God. We literally,
yeah,
we would say we can do this, but we can rely on God to either help or prevent us from doing it. So we genuinely
exactly.
just don't have any free will.
Exactly. And I think that would undermine, if you believe in the soul making theodicy, the
Yeah.
idea that actually growth and getting through difficult times is necessary in order to make our soul, so to speak, then that would undermine that idea too. And I often use the analogy of a parent. Like I often say to my students, like, if your parents stepped in and did everything for you, short term, you might be really happy about that and be like, oh, great, it's easy. But who's to say that the purpose of life is for it to be easy? That they're, and oftentimes you can use analogies as well. Like if you think about trees, for instance, the trees that are the strongest are the ones that withstand the really high winds, because the ones that don't often crumble, at the first sign of any kind of small gust. So it's like, maybe that analogy applies to humans to an extent. And even if it's painful. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There was also the idea that you can try and trick God. So
yeah.
in the sense, if God has true omniscience and is omnipotent, that he has the power and knowledge, and he could, even though you are going to trick God and you usually have a certain cereal in the morning, for example, and you change it the next morning to trick God because you think, no, he thinks you're going to have this, but you don't, he would know you're going to trick him anyway before you do it. So
exactly. Yes, there's no point into it. It kind of reminds me, have you seen Bruce Almighty?
Yes.
Yeah, it reminds me of that scene where I think he's saying like, how many fingers am I holding up or something? And then he's like, he ends up growing like an extra finger or something, and it's just like absolutely crazy, like the whole thing. But again, it's to show that God's omniscience doesn't just apply to the things that we're doing. It's also the stuff that we've ever thought about doing is stuff that God knows as well. So there's no point trying to pull the wool over God's eyes, because he is so much greater than us, and anything that we try to do is never going to be quite up to his level, let's say. I'd love to get your opinion on one last question, if that's okay, which is relating more, I think, back to omnibenevolence. Richard Swinburne makes the argument that God always does the morally best action. So this idea then that, again, even if we can't see it, it's not possible for God to do anything but the morally best action. I'd just love to get your opinion on that concept, and if you think it's a strong argument, or if there's any potential problems with it.
So Swinburne says that God will always do the best moral action.
Yeah, so not only will he do what's good, it will in fact be the best of all possible decisions that he could have made. Because it's God doing it, it will be the absolute best thing.
As humans, we just have to accept whatever happens to us is because God decided that it was the best moral decision for us.
I think so. And
that's what some people or some Christians would believe.
Yeah, and I think it ties back to what you were saying at the very beginning when you mentioned, for example, some of the things that God does in the Bible, like, bringing down the 10 plagues of Egypt, some of the actions that take place there. I'd just love to know if you think that we can actually still defend the idea that, some of these decisions that God takes, let's take the 10 plagues for an example in this case, can that actually be genuinely justified as the morally best action, given that it did seem to cause so much pain and suffering?
Yeah, and I think that's where I would go in a lesson, that as humans, we all experience some form of evil at some point in our life, and we say, oh, that was the best moral decision for God, or so for example, the Holocaust and 6 million Jews died. Some people question, well, where was God when that happened? And is God, we question God's true nature as to where he was and what he thought the best moral decision was, what his best moral decision was in that circumstance, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it might be a case where, it is the best, but we can't see it. And again, perhaps we can tie that into other things as well, like that lack of understanding, that epistemic distance. I do hesitate sometimes to bring that in because it sounds like a little bit of a cop-out, like kind of reminds me of the saying, like, God works in mysterious ways and we can just never understand. So, I think it's worth still exploring these concepts and looking at the potential issues. But yeah, there is always that element of like, maybe we're just talking about things that are way beyond what we could ever possibly know. But yeah, very interesting. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to talk through this with you. And I feel like we explored a lot of synoptic links there, which is great.
We did.
We did. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that you have a Twitter page where you share relevant resources. So would you like to share what the link is to that? And I'll put it in the notes as well.
Yes, so I have a Twitter page which I share resources, ideas, whole national approaches to RE, for example. If you would like to follow me, my Twitter handle is at philosophy ethics _ department.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, As. I feel like we could talk about this for hours on end, but we'll leave it there. And again, thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you. Take care. It's been great.
Take care. Cheers. Bye.